Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. So Ukraine War Frontline update for the 11th of October 2023. I'm fresh, I'm wearing my old retro Pompey top. Fresh back from Fratton Park last night, seeing Portsmouth in a cup game, in a low-level cup game that they won 5-1. Happy days. My 13-year-old son, twin boy, bought his granddad a ticket. He used to be a season ticket holder, so a bunch of us went, and it was lovely. But now we're back to our usual analyses of the front line, and we're going to look at the northeastern sector from Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna. Lots of claims about activity around Sinkivka and Ivanivka, which is here by Yahidne there. So the Russians apparently active around there. ISW says one Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces deployed powerful armoured groups to launch large-scale offensive operations near Sinkivka, Ivanivka and Makivka, and we're going to go there next. And another mill blogger claimed that Russian forces captured several Ukrainian positions near Sinkivka. No evidence of that at the moment, but still quite a lot of fighting there. Makivka is this place that we've seen the Russians try and attack or succeed, really. They have appeared to have taken some land over the last few days. That's just to the west of Ploshchanka and towards Makivka. Various claims that they are 600 meters, 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters from Makivka. Syriac Maps, the pro-Russian mapper, has the Ukrainians being pushed back. Russians making some fairly substantial gains there, as you can see from this map. The Russian army managed to capture many Ukrainian positions, they claim, northeast of Nevska and east of Makivka. So that is that. And with that, I think there have been some fairly heavy losses for the Russians over the last few days. I've shown you some footage, or at least referenced it. This is a T-90 getting taken out with an anti-tank guided missile. So I think it has been fairly costly for the Russians, as have all of their attacks recently, from what I can gather. Is it just a general comment that you might look at a map like this and think, right, there's a bunch of red pins here. Russia are doing quite well. They've taken some small amounts of land here and there, so they're on the offensive. It's kind of a weird thing because all of their offensives at the moment are costing them huge amounts of mechanized equipment and troops. You see the spike in numbers today. Really bad day at the office for the Russians, and it's almost as if their attacking does exactly want what Ukraine wants, wants of the kind of offensive or of the war at the moment, which is massive attrition of Russian forces, fixing them in other places. And I guess the Russians might be attempting to fix Ukrainian troops in these other places, hence attacking away from Zaporizhia. So there are these different elements to consider, but it certainly seems that the Russians are attriting themselves. Obviously, the Ukrainian defenders are doing this, but they're making these decisions that end up costing them huge amounts of equipment, and that then degrades their ability to defend effectively going forward and to commit to further offensives. So yeah, just not sure about this. Anyway, in this area, ISW claims, the American military think tank, that another prominent Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces have nearly reached the eastern outskirts of Makivka, as discussed, and advanced along the entire Novovodyanny-Ploshchanka line, where we're talking about. The Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces spokesperson Yevlash noted that Russian forces have increasingly deployed motorized rifle units, tank battalions, and Storm Z, those are the penal units, assault companies to the Kupiansk-Svatova-Kreminna line, and are using poorly trained Storm Z elements for reconnaissance and mine detection purposes. Really throwing them into the front, I guess, to do all those horrible tasks, and they are potentially more expendable, I guess, for the Russian forces. Anyway, Makivka is one of the areas on the front line that is seeing quite a bit of activity at the moment. We're going to come down to Bakhmut, where, as you can see, there isn't too much change in, or any change in, the front lines, but quite a bit of activity we've seen in this Seversk front line over time. Andrew Pepecha's live stream talked about how difficult it is for the Russians to succeed in this area because of the terrain. So as you can see here, I don't know if you can you can make out that it's quite green along here, and that's because that's the bottom of a river or stream valley. Here you can kind of see these bluffs, these steeper hills there that enable the Ukrainians to have good, vision, good view across here, and it makes it very difficult for the Russians to make gains here, which is why they're sort of trying to come up the side here along this railway line. But it's taken them 6 months to get sort of a couple of kilometers, really. Andrew Perpetua is saying like 2.5 kilometers if you take into account the bend here. 2.5 kilometers in 6, maybe 8 months is not a good return on investment, and they have lost lots of equipment there. They are making some gains along here, but the terrain isn't great for them. If you come up here to Verkhnokamianka, as with what we see down near Avdiivka, and indeed pretty much all across the southern front line, is that there are certain areas where in order to attack, you have to be moving through terrain that's just quite flat and open. So the Russians in this area sort of come along these tree lines, and you've got several kilometers of view of these columns, and you can just hit them, or single units or whatever, and you can easily hit them. So it's very difficult, but that very difficult to attack and complete successful maneuvers here. But that's the same for both sides, actually, which is why some of these places have not had great movement over time in terms of territorial gain. So if we look at the topographical map to just kind of explain this, hopefully that gives an idea where we are. So just to let you know that this is Solidar here. We've got the river coming up, well, coming down here. This is up towards Sacco Vansetti, and then it comes right to Vesely here, or east to Vesely. And these are the I guess the hills, the bluff behind that I was just talking about, and that goes even steeper back here, and you've got Berestova there. So here you have Vesely, you've got Berestova there, and they're trying to get up this higher ground here to move along the higher ground. It's very difficult, I think, to attack up the, you're coming down and then up. So if we look at the heights that you can see in the bottom right hand corner here, so this is 182 meters. That then comes down to the Ukrainian lines, 130 meters, 120 meters, 110, 90, 80, 70s, and then it starts going back up until you get to over 100, and then up here it's 140 odd meters. So these bluffs, it kind of goes down, then you've got the base here, and then up there. So let's look at that on a topographic map. Here it comes down, you got the base there, and then up. Get this on full screen. So here we have Solidar, and the Ukrainians have struggled to advance too far along here, up, because they're fighting uphill to these points, and the Russians have ATGM line of sight down to there and hit the Ukrainians if they try to come up here. But likewise, the Russians are going to struggle to do exactly the same, and so that's why this is all kind of grey zone, and the Russians are going to struggle to take these heights here. As we move further along to the east, you've got Berestova there. So actually the Russians have been able to come along and take this area here, but they are still struggling because there are heights behind that. So in order for them to get further here, they have to come down and then up again. And so the terrain doesn't really help out the Russians too much in this area. That looks to be the other Bilahorivka there. So let's go and come out of there and back onto here. So there are heights here that the Russians are on, and they're trying to use that to attack along here. But you get heights back here that then have line of sight over there. Sperna, they're finding it very difficult. It's quite costly for them to take this area. So difficult for the Russians, also difficult for the Ukrainians, of course. But I guess for the Ukrainians, territory is, like I keep saying, is your overall objective. But underneath that, you have all these other objectives: fixing, attriting equipment, taking out air defense systems, taking out logistics, taking out artillery. As long as they keep doing that in the area, the territory bit will come. So that shouldn't be the most important thing for them at the moment. It's just degrading the Russian forces to a point where they are unable to fulfill their defensive roles. Right. So when we come down to Bakivka, there is the Russians are trying to push down there to try and counterattack around here. There are quite a number of troops in the area, but the ISW talks quite a bit about how degraded the Russian troops are. So a Ukrainian military observer, so this does come from the Ukrainians, stated on October the 10th that as of October the 6th, a Russian operational tactical group consisting of regular forces, BARs, so those are Russian reserves, First Donetsk People's Republic, so DNR or DPR, Army Corps, not of the greatest quality, they won't be. Second Luhansk People's Republic, LNR, Army Corps, so they won't be of the greatest quality. Territorial Defense, there are more kind of reservists, if you like. And Storm Z, those are your penal troops. So a whole kind of melange, a whole mix of Russian troops, which will mean, command and control is somewhat more challenging. And it means you're going to have a great variety of equipment, of training, and of experience. Anyway, they're all operating in the Bakhmut direction. The military observer also reported that this operational tactical group has 60 to 65% of all arms and military equipment in the Russian southern grouping of forces. So there's 60 to 65%. The whole southern grouping of forces is concentrated in Bakhmut, which is committed throughout Donetsk Oblast otherwise, but that over half of its operational tactical groups, brigade and regiment level units have personnel shortages of 30 to 35% that are operating at 65 to 70%, which for some units you would argue in NATO, might make them combat ineffective. And about 10 to 15% of brigade and regiment levels units have a personnel shortage of up to 55 to 60%. So some of these are 40 to 45% strength. I mean, that has to be, in anyone's book, combat ineffective. If you have lost 55 to 60% of your unit, you are going to be unable to carry out the tasks that you've been assigned. So the Russians have their challenges here. Ukrainians have their challenges, obviously. We talk about terrain. We talk about Ukrainian need recruitment. They need, obviously, equipment. They need ammunition by the bucket load. There is talk, Andrew Perpetua's live stream, always worth listening to. Go and check his out. He goes into the fine details about all of these different areas of the conflict. But he's talking about how one of his sources in this particular area of Klishchivka was a bit down. Not because it's all going so badly, but actually he said that the Russians are just losing huge amounts of people, but they seem to have an endless supply. It's just the endless supply of meat to the grinder. And he was envisaging that the Ukrainians, because they find it difficult to take land and keep that land and keep going. It's this back and forth that happens because the Russians are throwing everything. They don't want to lose Bakhmut, and they're doing their whole defend by counterattack tactic here. That it's looking like they're going to have to dig in for the winter. And he says that all of these buildings are destroyed and the basements are pretty useless as well, or not great. And so it's going to be really, really muddy in this area. It'll be just not looking forward to digging in for the winter, and that's where the kind of low morale bit comes in, rather than the fighting against the Russians appears to be going fairly well in this area, and they are, causing the Russians to be attrited to a pretty significant state. The Ukrainians are trying to get across this railway line in a number of places, hit down to Zenopilia so they can come in behind Kurdyumivka, but no serious breakthrough at the moment. They are just chipping away. As you can see, no changes to the mapping there. So we're going to come on down to Avdiivka, which kind of took all the news yesterday. Just to let you know that, out of Bakhmut, having said I've come out of there, let's just remind ourselves that, as I said, there is great attrition going on. Asgard unit from the 28th Mechanized Brigade released compilation footage of Russian destroyed equipment, T-72, T-72s, a Nonna, that's a self-propelled gun. I think it's a self-propelled mortar. Mr. B howitzer, multiple launch rocket system, and gasoline truck. Right. These have been geolocated to various places. Let's just check a couple of geolocations just to see where they are hitting equipment on that front line to the north of Bakhmut, or even around Bakhmut. So in fact, a couple of these, so that is right behind the lines, sort of almost, I guess, east-southeast of Kurdyivka. You've got one of those bits of kit was taken out in Kadema, so they're in that general area. As you can see, the Nonna there. There's Kadema mentioned in one of these. Sorry, I was looking earlier. So on and so forth. So they are hitting these targets quite far behind the line still with drones. I say quite far behind. Let's see how far that is. That is 14 kilometers. So actually, this could be another example of how Ukrainian drones are able to be used beyond the normal 10-kilometer range. So we've heard that 17.4 kilometers is the highest that I've heard so far. So they're starting to get that drone capability, and here they're hitting targets either at that range or slightly beyond it. So anyway, that could be a case of softening up in order to go attack further and gain more ground in that area. Now, Avdiivka yesterday was all this talk about a massive Russian attack, that they had gathered 200 pieces of artillery and were hammering particularly this northern area around the coke plant and that's coke, the raw material, not Coca-Cola, and the industrial area here. So really heavy aviation. And although aviation has been hindered by the weather, but very heavy artillery, and that the claim was that the Russians were pushing for a big attack in this area to kind of close the neck here around the cauldron or the sack, that is the net, that is Avdiivka, to try and attack from the north, come down here towards Berditsy and step over and attack up towards Severny, Tonyenka, as well as Pervomarsky too. So quite a lot of attacking all over the place. That should be blue, by the way, not red. Apologies. I can't change that from Google Earth. So they have made some gains, as according to Syriac Map. So let's go and see how the narrative played out. So yesterday, people like Tim White and other Ukrainian sources were saying, pro-Ukrainian sources were saying, it's not looking good in Avdiivka, and there were lots of Ukrainians claiming, it's looking bad. The Russians are putting on a properly big attack here. Fighters admitting they've lost positions. This explains a lull in the last few days with Russia transferring troops for the attack. So feathers are climbing along the entire front line from the direction of Krasnohorivka to Vodyanya. Equipment and infantry are dark. Aviation works without interruption. Despite heavy losses, they were able to capture some of our positions near Avdiivka. We have also had losses. We're not without that. And Avdiivka, the enemy had certain successes in the area of Vodyany and Krasnohorivka. The situation on the route is getting worse. So it was all looking a bit hairy. And then you had Rybar, the overtly pro-Russian source, putting massive gains for the Russians up to the north. Big arrows all around with their map saying, they're attacking here, they're doing this. This is all going well for the Russians. Russian troops broke through near Avdiivka. The offensive is underway. Looming encirclement in bold of Ukrainian garrison. Early in the morning, Russian troops began massive fire training on the Ukrainian fortification or in Avdiivka. The number of shells fired in one day was truly unique. Both artillery and FAB 1,500. So the really big aviation guided glide bombs being sent into the area. After the artillery preparation, the Russian assault squads also launched an attack from the south in the direction of Spartak. According to preliminary information, the Russian armed forces occupied a section of the E50 road south of the fortified area. Well, we had seen this previously anyway, so this is Spartak and this is the area. So I think that was what had happened the day before, to be perfectly honest. But let's see what Rybar has to say. It is reported that Russian paratroopers launched an attack from the direction of Krasnohorivka, so that's to the north, in the direction of the railroad. As a result, the Russian armed forces have surged towards Berditsy, fighting is taking place on the approaches to it. For now, the configuration of the front at the site is covered with a fog. It is possible that the Russian army fighters broke through the defense near the railway line and bypassing Petrovska reached Berdichi. So he's saying there it's possible, but then draws on the map that it has happened and that they're actually pushing past Berdichi. So this is to go to the north again here. So Rebar making the claims that they've come over the railway line past Stepova to Berdichi and are actually attacking down towards Orlivka. And that would be an absolute disaster for the Ukrainians. Real problem. And this, they had his Rebar really had his tail up and was shouting about this. Given the lack of clear coordination between the Ukrainian units, the attack was a surprise for them. However, in the near future, reinforcements may be transferred to stabilize the front. That's just in case he's being overconfident in his claims. It's like, well, they might kind of stabilize it. So it's important to consolidate the achieved success. After Berdichi, it would be most logical for the Russian forces to knock the AFU out of the hills adjacent to the northwest. They offer a view of the Orlivka Lastochkina line, which with simultaneous movement from the south, Opitny Vodyany, will create big problems for the enemy at Avdiivka. Okay, but he's saying that they need to consolidate all of these gains around this area, take out all of this hill area, and then attack from the south to take this before concentrating on Avdiivka, or basically you encircle it and trap everyone there. So that was what he was saying, and saying more to that as well. Going on to say, the assault groups managed to break through Ukrainian armed forces defenses at the slag heap located southwest of Krasnohorivka. This is a dominant height from where the Russian forces will be able to control the approaches, etc., etc. And that at the moment they're clearing that slag heap in that area there. That's where they're talking about. So at maps then, yesterday, or not then, but yesterday, probably the same time, said the attack of the Russian army north and south of Avdiivka continues with high intensity. Troops are making advances, but they are smaller than some maps show. And I think that's a reference to Rebar. Actually, the clashes are closer to the Stepova rather than Berdichi area. As it was said previously, the battle is difficult and won't be easy to advance. So this is much more reserved from Rebar, much more reserved from Syriac than Rebar. So saying that actually they haven't really got past the railway line. They're working towards Stepova. They're not at Berdichi and attacking towards Orlivka, and the Ukrainians are pushing back. So this is more reserved, but advances nonetheless. The Ukrainians pushed back. The Russians began offensive operations in order to capture the city of Avdiivka. During the first day of operations, troops managed to capture a series of positions around Krasnohorivka and advanced towards Avdiivka coke and chemical plant, where they reached the main garbage hill, where clashes with the Ukrainian army are ongoing there. And that's actually talking about that clearing that Rebar was talking about, clearing of that slag heap. So that's Syriac maps, but at the same time also admit that actually down south by Opitny, the Ukrainians have managed to capture more positions northwest of Opitny. In addition, Russian army attempts to advance from the axis towards Severny. So this is the idea, and remember all of these three should be blue, that the Ukrainians have taken quite a significant amount of land given the difficulty that this land, it presents in trying to take it. So actually, this is a significant amount of land for the Ukrainians to take, given that the Russians are supposed to be attacking here and are supposed to be, attacking themselves towards Severny. We have seen them attack up this road past Vodyany, where we saw, and Andrew Perpetua has a really good analysis on this, where there's a little bridge here that one of the vehicles, a Brem 2, an engineering vehicle, fell off. Is like, several things are odd. One, why is an engineering vehicle the point at the front of this attacking line? Okay, they're still back from where they are, supposed to be aiming for, but you can aim ATGMs there. I mean, it's not crazy far away. You're going to have Ukrainian teams, that's what ATGMs can. That's 2.5 kilometers. They can fire from up here and hit that Brem. So I don't know why the Brem's at the front. Anyway, it fell off the bridge, and you're saying the bridge wasn't even really supposed to be there. There isn't anything that it's getting over. There's a slight dip here, but what happened apparently some time back is a bridge laying engineering vehicle was taken out here, and they recovered the engineering vehicle, I think, but couldn't recover the bridge. But then the bridge was kind of just put in place here, but it's not really necessary. And as a result, it's actually slightly more difficult for the vehicles to navigate, and they fell off the bridge into this slight dip here, and that's the end of that Brem 2. And then I believe some of these vehicles, once they had, gone out here, were then taken out variously, and there seems to be some evidence of the Russians losing equipment there. So but nearby, the Ukrainians appear to be making gains. So it's all sorts of stuff going on here. Well, Michael McKay makes of this. He's very pro-Ukrainian. Yesterday, the Russians invaded. The Russian invaders conducted an assault on Nutanov Avdiivka. They engaged up to 3 battalions with tanks and armored vehicles. Ukrainian defenders repelled all the attacks, inflicting heavy losses of manpower and equipment on the Russians. And you can see the arrows where he thinks all those attacks are taking place. So he's very boyish about that. Now, Special Kherson Cat says about this attack on the Avdiivka front. Today was one of the most difficult days at the Avdiivka direction. The enemy went on the attack with several columns filled with infantry. The attack was accompanied by artillery, aviation, and missile strikes. Columns advanced from Krasnohorivka, Novoselivska, Druha, Zvodyane, Pisky, and Vesely. Russians managed to capture certain positions, but considering the number of personnel and equipment that was involved, the results were simply deplorable for the enemy. But there is imagery of like 50 troops getting out of these vehicles, and then claims that they've been taken out by cluster munitions. Don't know whether that's definitely true, but the troop losses for today were very high, as according to the General Staff, Ukrainian General Staff. So Russians, it continues, hoped for a blitzkrieg. Losses of equipment are colossal. Analysts will soon be counting hundreds of Russian infantrymen were engaged, and they are still roaming the no man's land. The fighting continues. Indeed, everything could have been much worse, but the coordinated work of the defense forces of Ukraine produced results. Of course, it was not without losses, and there is some footage of Ukrainian troops retreating, basically running from positions that they had lost. Russians were spinning that in like leaving their wounded behind and blah blah blah. They're all running away. But this was all at the same time. They did lose some fortified positions, as Andrew Perpetua is saying. You are going to lose your frontline trenches in a massive attack, but that's not the problem. You fall back to your more robust defenses in your second line of defense, and then once the attack finishes and runs its course, then you do your counterattack and try and take that back, as we've seen the Russians do so much. But there will be a loss of positions. That goes without saying. But it's what is the ratio of losses for Russians to Ukrainians. So the fighting continues. Indeed, everything could have been much worse. And of course, it wasn't without losses. Russians' statements about the entry into Badichi that was circulating on the internet, so Rebars claims, is just another sick fantasy of propagandists. Of course, not everything is rosy near Avdiivka, but the first attack on the real Soviet army was repelled. And there is, various footage to suggest the Russians did lose quite a lot of equipment, and further footage of equipment being lost. I mean, that's Mariinka, but all over the shop, stuff is being evident, starting to be seen in the feeds. Right, just to finish this off, Dmitry from War Translated saying, interesting from Russian volunteer Mers commenting on Avdiivka, saying the offensive had to be started to pull some of the Ukrainian reserves from Bakhmut. So the idea is that this offensive is not just to take Avdiivka, but to pull troops from Bakhmut area because the Russians are under the cosh there. That's according to a Russian source. It started with attempting to retake positions already lost to Ukrainians due to a lack of quality infantry for Russians. He says the lack of infantry is now compensated by massive artillery barrages, but this won't last long, at least until Ukrainians haven't brought up their own artillery reserves. At the best case scenario, he says, Russians will make Ukrainian life in Avdiivka more difficult. So best case scenario is that they just make it a bit more difficult, but at what loss? I mean, you can check out all the text there from the actual source. I'm not going to read it out, but yeah, the shortage of experienced and motivated infantry on both sides is terrible. Accordingly, it will be possible to advance for it. To say that on both sides is terrible is probably to really admit, if you read between the lines, then it's probably worse for your own side. If you're trying to do the whole both sidesism thing, then the inference, the inference I would make is that it really is bad for you. If you're admitting that but having to couch it as like, oh, we're both really suffering here, it means actually you know that you're really suffering. The sad state of our infantry. This is a Russian, volunteer just not in a good place and not saying particularly great things about their state of affairs. Accordingly, it will be possible to advance for exactly as long as it is possible to compensate for this sadness with artillery. Compensate with a large margin, I would say. When the enemy artillery reserve arrives and starts working, we will have to stop and dig in. But the Avdiivka attack doesn't look like this isn't a ringing endorsement of what they've done from their own troops here. In Avdiivka, judging by the lack of joyful proclamations, so just what I was saying, over the past 12 hours, Russians have not been able to achieve any major breakthroughs, but continue attempts to advance, taking serious losses. Khodorkovsky, so he's a guy in charge of the Vostok Battalion, a Russian commander, says that over the past 24 hours, we have managed to worsen the enemy's position in Avdiivka, so they have had some success, and reach the lines from which we can control the communication of the Avdiivka garrison with the rest of the group. Others say that even with success, Avdiivka is too big and well defended of a stronghold to be taken quickly, and the whole operation may take as much as several months. Deep State's map last night's comment says that the Russian blitzkrieg attempt has failed, right? And then the numbers that we talked about this morning: 820 personnel losses, 34 tanks, 91 APVs, and 18 artillery pieces. It's just phenomenal, and a lot of that is no doubt going to be concerning the losses of the Russians in Avdiivka. Now, I don't want to be painting this as if it's all wonderful for the Ukrainians. This is a really tough area, but the Russians are doing the Ukrainians a favor in doing attacks like this, in my opinion, because this doesn't look like they're gearing up for a massive, like a summer counteroffensive, like the Ukrainians have done, which hasn't got as far as they would like, and all that kind of stuff. But that's a proper big counteroffensive. This doesn't look like a massive Russian offensive here. This looks like a localized offensive that ends up attriting the Russian forces to a really problematic level and taking minimal land. I don't know what they gain out of this. Anyway, moving on. The ISW says of this area, and I've kind of said most of this, that they're attacking north and south. A Kremlin-affiliated Russian mill blogger claimed the Russian forces reached the outskirts of Bedichi, but denied other Russian reports that Russian forces captured the settlement. So some have even saying they've been captured, some saying they've got that far, and then Surya Map saying no, they haven't even got over the railway line. Russian sources claim that Russian forces captured unspecified positions near Avdiivka and Krasnohorivka, which they almost certainly have. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces intend to cut off the ground lines of communication, so there's the roads and railways going into Avdiivka. And that's not to say that the railway is a ground line of communication for an actual train, but these are still useful roads or places that they can drive down, perhaps, maybe not here. It is a bit too close to the front line. Nevertheless, so they're trying to cut off the ground lines of communication that supply Avdiivka, try to encircle the Ukrainians, though Russian forces are likely conducting fixing operations intended to pin Ukrainian forces near Avdiivka and maybe draw them from Bakhmut, rather than attempting a complete and full operational encirclement of the settlement. Russian mill bloggers noted that Ukrainian forces have built extensive fortifications there since 2014, making it difficult for Russian forces to break through those defenses. Absolutely. It will not be easy for the Russians to break through there at all. Activity in Mariinka. There's still footage kicking around that we see that I showed you the other day of stuff getting blown up around there. So Russians are trying to take that incrementally. And then there is activity around Makhilska and Vuhledar, where both sides are attacking each other, as far as I can work out. Claims from both sides that have repelled attacks. As we come to the Velika Novosilka salient here, where we have the We have Priyutne, Staromilske, and places. The Russian mill bloggers here claim that Russian forces captured up to 10 strongholds in an unspecified area on the left flank of the Remivka direction. So that would be the left flank of the Russians would be around the Priyutne area. But that's completely vague and unsubstantiated. I don't know. There's too much to report of here. We will go on now to this is interesting. So I saw this in Null Reports. Preliminary information that Ukrainian forces have entered the settlement of Zahirna in Zaporizhia, waiting for confirmation. Null Reports had said back in December that they got in there previously. So that is, as we move to the west and come along here past Marfapil, past Strozhnyanka, and we get towards Myrna, there is Zahirna here, which is, you know, a little bit behind the lines maybe, but that's otherwise I guess it's on the front line really. That would be significant because that's not something the Ukrainians have done recently, and maybe this is a way of getting the Russians to think, oh, hang on, be distracted, have to commit forces there. I would have thought these kind of attacks in places nearby might be quite sensible to keep as a good use of your own troops, to keep the Russians on their toes and get them to relocate some of their own troops and worry about breaks in the line. If we're talking about Robotina, doesn't seem to be any change there. No map has had any change in this area. The ISW says a Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces have advanced west of Novofedorivka and unsuccessfully attacked it itself. But I thought that was pretty significant because Novofedorivka is quite a long way away, right? But if the Ukrainians have actually, if a Russian mill blogger is claiming that Ukrainians have attacked Novofedorivka unsuccessfully, that's incredible. They've gone an awful long way. I doubt that at all. I mean, it's probably one of these towards Novofedorivka, and you're going to have fighting over here. I mean, there's too many tree lines and even major trenches between Novofedorivka and the front line, so I doubt that is the case. But you know, worth mentioning. Another mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces unsuccessfully attacked Novoprokopivka. Again, we have the same problem I've talked about for the Russians, is that any attacks require going over open fields where you're just... The Russians are dug into this Novoprokopivka as a settlement here. And so any attack is just signposted and you just drive into a kill box and yeah, it's not going to end particularly well. So it's really difficult. The Ukrainians have gotten to Novoprokopivka with kind of reconnaissance groups and whatnot, or special forces, or I don't know, I'm speculating here, but they have got in there with different personnel, but not being able to maintain a foothold there. It's just really difficult, and that's why maybe they're thinking getting into Kopani and going this direction might allow them, you know, once you've got a place surrounded, it becomes easier. Novoprokopivka is going to be difficult to get in there from the west, or from the east, sorry, because you've got the trenches coming up there, and that's going to take clearing out these trenches. But that could be possible if they succeed there. But that's quite a lot of ground to the northwest for the Ukrainians to have to take in order to try and flank from the west. So that is pretty much that for Robotina. We move to the west to Pyatikhatki and Suryat maps. This is something we haven't heard about for an awful long time. Activity around Pyatikhatki, where the Russians have apparently restarted offensive operations there in the Vasilivka region and made new advances northeast of that village, which is kind of surprising. That's Suryat maps, no confirmation of that elsewhere, so take it with a pinch of salt, but it could be that the Russians have made some gains in that area. And then we come on to the Dnipro River, where apparently weather has kind of put a hold, you know, on certain activity there. ISW saying a Russian source claimed that Ukrainian activity on the Dnipro Islands has decreased due to worsening weather conditions, but they are still talking about that and worried about a massing of Ukrainian troops there. Anyway, that was today's update. I thought I'd focus quite a lot on Avdiivka because it was massively in the socials yesterday, and it will be interesting to see what the Russians do today, whether they will continue that, whether they think they have the momentum, whether they do have the momentum and can go on to take further gains, and the question is whether those gains are worth the costs that will be incurred, and also, you know, what's going on to the south, because there are sort of conflicting claims as to success for either side down there. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care. Speak to you soon.